Welcome to AP Art History. This is the first of many podcast lectures that will take us from cave bowls to corned beef can bowls, and from around 15,000 BCE to just a few years ago. Because the College Board has made significant changes to the AP Art History course, I am recording a full new set of lectures for this course. My primary audience is, of course, my own students. But if anyone else wants to listen, well, welcome. If you are listening to this at home, you'll notice that I try to pause, at least briefly, after asking a question. Stop the video and think about your own answer, okay? Drum rolls, please. This is the first work of art that we will look at in this course, the first of hundreds. I'm not going to tell you yet who the artist is or what the painting is about. Instead, I want you to look at it closely and tell me what you notice about the painting. Let's start with this question. What is possibly the most important element in this painting? And I'll give you a hint. It's one you hardly notice at first glance. Well, look at the bottom center. What do you see? It's a head, or more specifically, it's a severed head. But I know that when I first saw this painting, the head didn't register. I was too busy focusing on the sense of menace that the painting conveyed, the sense that something scary was about to come through the open door that's casting light into the room. So, what do you think the two women are looking at? They're not looking at the head, surprisingly enough. Given their expressions, they have to be looking at or fearing that they are about to see something even worse. What do you notice about the artist's use of light? Well, think about how light is used in a theater. Spotlights draw our attention to the central figure in the drama, and spotlights also have the effect of casting the rest of the scene into a dark shadow. Just to give you a taste of art history vocabulary to come, that technique is called tenebrism, and it's a feature of art from this Italian Baroque period, which is very theatrical. It's a period of time when people loved and often attended the opera. But for now, just notice that the artist has directed very little light toward the head, which you would think might be the central focus of this painting. Well, before I get to the story behind the scene, let me make a more general point about what the artist is doing. This is a painting that tells a story, or in more formal art history or English terms, it presents a narrative. Note that not all works of art tell a story or contain a narrative. This painting by Vincent van Gogh is vibrant, beautiful, but it does not really tell a story, does it? Narrative poses a special dilemma for painters and sculptors. Unless they're producing a whole series of works, artists have to tell a story in a single moment, and that means that they must make a choice. Which moment in the story are they going to use to capture the essence of the story? So if narrative painting tells a story, it does it with something more like a screen capture or a movie still. If this were a movie, what would you expect to show up on the screen in the next few moments? Something scary, probably. But the artist can't show you the next moment, at least not in this painting. The viewer has to imagine the next moment coming. So does anyone have a clue about what's happening here? I'll give you a hint. This is a story from the Bible, or at least from one of the books of the Apocrypha, which are considered part of the Bible by Catholics. The story comes from the book of Judith, and here's what happens. Holofernes is a general in the army of the king of Assyria. He has been out laying waste to Assyria's neighbors in the Middle East, killing people, killing livestock, destroying villages, raping women, enslaving children, all the usual business of ancient and, unfortunately, of modern warfare. As the Assyrian army approaches the small state of Israel, Israel's leaders fall into despair. They basically don't think they stand a chance against the Assyrians led by Holofernes, and they decide, well, they'd better just surrender. They'll surrender their women, their children, their land, their livestock, all in the really pretty faint hope that Holofernes will decide to spare their lives. Judith is described in Scripture as a beautiful and virtuous widow, and she's not willing to go along with this defeatist program. Instead, she puts on her finest clothing, her perfume, makeup, and jewels, and she calls on her maidservant to accompany her. Boldly, she walks into the camp of Holofernes, and basically what she tells the general is, look, I realize you're going to win this battle. I don't want to die, and I'm willing to share some of the Israelites' military secrets so that you can capture it into the city and sneak into the city and capture it, and I can survive. Holofernes is very taken with the notion of getting past Israel's defenses. He's even more taken with Judith. He invites her into his tent and serves her a sumptuous feast. During this banquet, Judith keeps refilling Holofernes' wine glass. The book of Judith actually says, quote, he drank more than he had ever drunk in his entire life. Well, there's a little life lesson here, since the story does not end well for Holofernes. Judith gets Holofernes so thoroughly blotto that he can't stop her when she pulls out a sword and chops off his head. She shoves the head into a bag, and somehow she and her maidservant manage to sneak out of the camp and scurry back to her Israelite town. She presents the severed head to the very surprised elders of Israel. They stick the head on a pole. The sight of their murdered general terrifies the Assyrian army, and they run away. Israel is saved. No thanks, I would note, to the cowardly men. Sorry, guys. But many thanks to this brave and beautiful widow. So, what moment in this dramatic story does the artist choose to tell the narrative, at least in this particular painting? It's not what we might consider the most dramatic moment, when Judith is pulling out the sword and whacking away at the general's head. Instead, what we see is the terrifying aftermath. The adrenaline of the attack has worn off, and now these two young women somehow have to manage to sneak out of camp without being caught. So why choose this particular moment, do you think? Well, it's arguably the most dangerous point in the story, since there's no going back now. Holofernes has been murdered. They could get caught quite literally red-handed. Notice how the artist also uses light and shadow to create suspense. If this were a Hollywood movie, we'd hear creepy music now, right? So here we have another rendition, another painting by a different artist of the Judith story. This artist is actually even more famous. So hang in there, you will get the artist's names, and you'll need to know them both. But first, I want you to think about how this painting is different from the one you first saw. I realize it's easier to answer that question when you see the two paintings side by side. So, what differences do you notice? Well, the most obvious one, which we've already talked about, is that the two artists choose to capture the scene the screen at different points in the story. The picture on the right captures perhaps the greatest moment of terror for the women when they're trying to get away after they've committed murder. The picture on the left focuses on the murder itself, the moment when Holofernes meets his death. Do you notice any other differences? In the painting on the left, Judith is painted as a much more sensual figure. It's a little hard to see this on a slide, but if you were standing close to the actual painting, you would notice that her nipples are erect. And in fact, we know from x-rays that art historians have taken of this painting that in the original version, Judith wasn't wearing a blouse at all. She was painted bare-breasted. Maybe the patron asked that she be covered up before the painting was hung in church. Maybe this reflects a certain controversy about the Judith story. Did she kill Holofernes before or after the planned seduction? Another difference is that the maidservant in the painting on the left is an old woman, really a crone, whereas the maidservant in the painting on the right is a young woman, much the same age as her mistress Judith. So she appears more as a comrade in arms, as an ally. Any more big differences? Well, the head in the painting on the left is much more prominent. This painting, I would argue, is more about Holofernes, less about Judith than the painting on the right. I'm going to move on to another painting of the Judith story by the artist of the painting on the right. This slide lets you look at the two together. The painter is Artemisia Gentileschi. She is one of the most prominent women painters we will encounter in this course until the 20th century. But before I talk about these two paintings, let me stop and note for the benefit of my own students that these are the first works that appear in your 2-volume workbook. By the end of the year, you will have filled almost 800 pages with notes on a specific set of works. 250 of these images are actually required by the College Board. Another 50 or so, including these paintings, are required by Ms. Jacobs and me, because we think they'll really add to your understanding of art history, or sometimes because we're irked at the College Board for leaving them out. The note-taking categories in your workbook are going to seem confusing, especially at first. So, for example, what is the difference between a work's function and its meaning? Well, function, just as we use it in ordinary language, means an intended use. So, suppose the work is a clay pot that is shaped like a dragon. In this case, the difference between function and meaning is reasonably clear. The function is to hold liquid, perhaps for some special purpose. The meaning is going to be tied up with the significance of dragons in that particular culture. For an Italian Baroque painting, the function was usually to decorate a church and to send a message. And of course, that message is also the meaning of the painting. So for now, hang in there and spend more time looking and listening than writing. Don't worry too much about the distinctions in the categories. Just try to learn and to take notes on these works. There will be lots of opportunities to go back and fill in the blanks, and some of them, frankly, aren't going to turn out to matter. But get used to the idea that you are going to be required to completely and accurately identify works of art. So what does that scary College Board phrase mean? Well, according to the College Board itself, full identification means the title or designation, the name of the artist and or culture of origin, the date of creation, and the media used, which in this case, by the way, is oil paint. For the College Board required works, you are going to be receiving a list of the works with all of these 4 identifiers laid out. But I know what you're thinking. Do you really have to know that one work was painted in 1612 and the other in 1623 times 300 works? Time to go see my counselor and get out of this class. Well, don't panic yet. The College Board goes on to say that you should know, and I quote, the time in which the work was created. In this case, Italian Baroque would be a good start, but yes, you should know that this pretty much means the 1600s. If you can remember exact dates, if you have that kind of brain, you learned all the baseball scores when you were 6, that's fine, but it won't be the end of the world if you can just get fairly close. The College Board hasn't come out and said that directly, but I've talked to other AP teachers, and I think that's going to be right. Any rate, you will be amazed by the timeline you have in your head by May. But for now, it's only August, so let's get back to having fun with paintings. So, does it change your view of these paintings by Artemisia Gentileschi to know that she was raped by her art teacher at the age of 17 and then became the central figure in a very public rape trial? Her father, who was also a prominent painter, was outraged by the attack and forced Artemisia to testify at the trial. To determine whether or not her testimony was reliable, the court subjected her to torture. Specifically, she had thumb screws applied to her hands. And remember, she is an artist. So this is a painting made as a very young woman, in fact, just a year after the rape trial. Now let's listen to this passage from the book of Judith, chapter 9, verse 2. And it's Judith speaking. She's basically praying. She's imploring God. O Lord, God of my ancestor Simeon, remember how you armed Simeon with a sword to take revenge on those foreigners who seized Dinah, who was a virgin, tore off her clothes and defiled her. They stripped her naked and shamed her. They raped her and disgraced her, even though you had forbidden this. Do you think maybe this passage resonated with the teenage artist? I just threw this in for fun. My husband took this photo when we saw this painting in the Art Museum in Naples in 2013. One regret I have about this course is that we'll mostly see art on slides. Whenever you have a chance to see art in museums, and we're going to try to give you some, seize those chances, okay? So let's go back to the other painting we saw of the same scene. On the left, you see the early Artemisia Gentileschi painting, and on the right, you see the painting by Caravaggio, one of the most important artists we will study in this course, and consider this due warning a real favorite of mine. Both he and Artemisia Gentileschi worked in Rome. He worked somewhat earlier, was much more prominent. She would almost certainly have seen this painting before she painted her own version of the story, and certainly she would have been very familiar with his work. I've talked a little bit about Artemisia Gentileschi's life. Well, what about Caravaggio's? He was the bad boy of the Roman art world. So here's an account written by a contemporary just a few years after this painting was made. After a fortnight's work, Caravaggio will swagger about for a month or two with a sword at his side, a servant following him from one ball court to the next, ever ready to engage in a fight or an argument, so that it is most awkward to get along with him. In 1606, just 8 years after this painting, he killed a young man in a brawl and fled from Rome with a price on his head. In fact, it is thought, though there is some dispute over this, that the fight was over the woman who modeled for Judith in this picture. She was a well-known Roman prostitute named Phillida, who was one of Caravaggio's favorite models. So, on the left, you have the story of Judith and Holofernes, as captured by a recently raped teenager who goes on to paint versions of the story of Judith and Holofernes at least 6 times. It was important to her. On the right, you have the same story painted by the bad boy who lives a life of violence and is probably contemplating the possibility of meeting a violent end himself. And at the risk of spoiling a future lesson, he does. So armed with this knowledge, let's talk again about similarities and differences. What similarities do you see between these works? Now, realize we're now comparing 2 different works. This early Artemisia Gentileschi beheading scene and Caravaggio's beheading scene on the right. Well, one similarity is that the composition of the paintings is quite similar. Composition means the way the elements of the painting are arranged on the canvas. So notice here that Judith's arms are posed very similarly, essentially in forceful parallel and diagonal lines. And we'll be talking about this more this week and throughout the course. Diagonal lines, the direction moving from top to bottom to the right, very often conveys action and activity, creates a sense of drama. Remember, and I just said this, that Artemisia Gentileschi would probably have known the Caravaggio version well. Notice, too, that strong contrast of dark and light, the theatrical spotlighting effect, which is very characteristic of this period. This is called the Baroque period, and we will get there. What about, and I should note, by the way, this use of darkness is referred to as tenebrism, the use of light to spotlight and create modeling. In other words, to make a two-dimensional piece of canvas look three-dimensional is known as chiaroscuro. You're going to have that in your study guides. In the Caravaggio painting on the right, however, Judith is off to the side, and it's Holofernes in his death agony that really dominates the painting. In the Gentileschi version, the 2 women are on top. They are in a position of dominance. And note again that the maidservant in Gentileschi's painting is a young woman, really almost an equal partner in the beheading. The maidservant in Caravaggio's painting is not only old and passive, art historians are almost certain that she is a famous procuress or pimp who ran one of Rome's most notorious brothels. So what do you think? Did their life stories come out in this painting? At least a little? One other interesting biographical note, Artemisia Gentileschi's maidservant did not protect her at the time of the rape. So why paint her so sympathetically? We simply don't know. So I'm going to end by showing you a painting that Artemisia Gentileschi made of the story somewhat later in her life. What differences do you notice here? Well, this Judith is an older and tougher woman. She's strong, determined, totally confident in her actions. So yes, I think the artist's life and vision helps shape art, but so does the artist's time and place. We're going to return to Judith and Holofernes in my next lecture when we look at art in its historical and cultural context.